Let's start this. Hello and welcome to Monarchism Unfiltered. I am one of your hosts, McCosk.
I am.
And this is Bronze.
And today we're going to be doing a bit of a Q&A session. And if that doesn't necessarily work out because we don't, get enough questions or whatever, we'll probably just start talking about spinning out whatever one of the questions are. But yeah, so I think. I'm not sure exactly where to start.
I should probably explain how it works.
I think. Yeah. Okay.
So how it's going to work is that we're in the Discord for the podcast. In case you're not here at the moment, and the people who are not us, they are muted, but they can ask questions in the channel specifically marked for that purpose, and then they will be unmuted so they can ask the question, and then they will go back to being muted. At least that's how I did it last time, but we might do it differently this time, and then we'll discuss the question.
So, starting up, we have Spruce Goose, former guest on the show, with the topic of heraldry.
Hello. I've got sort of a 1.5 questions about it. The first one is sort of a general one because I want to know what's your best and your worst. What makes a great emblem and what makes a really terrible one? Does it go best on a flag, on a shield? What's the kind of dynamic for that? And the one after that is, why does Satan have a coat of arms, and has anyone ever used it?
Pertinent questions.
I think in terms of my what I think is good in a piece of heraldry is sort of simplicity of basic imagery. So I think you can, because heraldry is different from a flag. Like a national flag is not, like heraldry is not national flags, and so I think it should operate under different basic rules, and it usually does. And I think when heraldry gets to looking quite ugly, it is often the result of that you basically have some kind of overly complex image, be that, say, I don't know, like a swan or something, that is then done quite crudely. And I think that sort of ends up meaning that it kind of looks quite ugly. And I think I don't know, I can't think of any examples off the top of my head. I'm not an expert on heraldry, but that's sort of the basic thing. And I do think that very complex heraldry, where they get doubling from families and so forth, can be quite good or quite nice, but it's not always perfect, as it were. I think to the second question of why does Satan have a coat of arms, I think the biggest reason is basically just in in manuscripts, that in manuscripts you would get in manuscripts, if you're talking about Satan and Satan is in a battle with someone, then you draw a little image of Satan and the Archangel Michael or whoever, and you identify them with their heraldry and imagery and so forth. I don't think anyone used because also it's not that well known. It's not a very, very common thing. Heraldry of the Trinity was more common, but that was also you wouldn't go around wearing a triangle on your shield, because that'd be kind of semi-blasphemous. I don't know, Makos, you have an opinion on that specifically?
I have an opinion on both, in fact. So, what makes a good heraldry versus what makes a bad heraldry? The answer is you follow those goddamn tincture laws till the fucking letter, or else. Because heraldry that pivots away from tincture laws tends to look like cancer. As for what makes the worst possible one, you either have the just listener or questioner, if you're here, just take the liberty to look up Liberian state flags, and although not particularly heraldry, if your heraldry looks nearly or anything in the realm of similarity with a Liberian state flag, you done goofed. Other examples are just extreme marshalling. Like, for example, there is a coat of arms in the Canadian Heraldic Society that is over 500 different coats of arms mashed together. Suffice to say, it looks like a blasphemy on legs. On the topic of attributed arms, because this is because that's where Satan's coat of arms comes. Basically, 13th century heraldic devices, coats of arms, what have you, becoming really popular. Turns out, you know, people need to have arms, both in a historical setting and also to like simplify bookkeeping, as I did. So the Satan's coat of arms was historically used basically to either assimilate to like basically it was used to mark the influence of the devil. If a knight was portrayed with that shield, it was either Satan or basically someone possessed. It was used for like more literary purposes. No one would have used. I mean, even the usage of frogs in heraldry is incredibly rare and, to my knowledge, nigh on unattested.
Yeah, I mean, because there's a reason that frogs are on Satan's coat of arms, which is it's an allusion to the Book of Revelation 16:13, where it says where it describes three unclean spirits like frogs. As frogs have always had a sort of a bad reputation, so it's not something you would typically put on a coat of arms.
Coat of arms, well, right. And a lot of things with like worse significance, like for example, hydras do actually exist in coats in heraldry, but even though they're very rare. But
Dragons all the time.
what? Sorry,
Dragons too.
Yeah, dragons. Yeah, yeah. Because I mean, yeah,
frogs.
I mean, I think the difference. I think there's a pretty obvious difference between like a dragon, hydra, and a frog. Like a frog is, I think, far more obviously unclean.
Well, I mean, a dragon might sort of be like the type of evil that a knight defeats in a romance, but the frog is sort of like that's dirty, that's sort of satanic. It's not like a great evil that is defeated. It's just sort of like an all-consuming, like sort of like a filth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially because if you think about like disease and infection, like that's especially because like a lot of metaphor for sin is based around disease. So people would associate, associate, yeah.
So this is, sort of the reason why you don't see that many coats of arms with rats on them, for example.
Well, yeah, because again, it's this association of disease and bad, obviously, because rats bring diseases, rats eat food, all this kind of stuff. Dragons are kind of fanciful and somewhat interesting at least. Yeah, I mean, I think also with the attributed arms thing, of like its use in manuscripts. Obviously, there's the point that like the people, if you want to like skim read something, get the summary of it, you don't really want to. You basically it's yeah, it's useful to have some kind of shorthand. Um, I think on heraldry in general, heraldry I think is quite interesting, at least historically, because obviously Murkowski mentioned the its use as like bookkeeping, but to my knowledge, there isn't really anything like heraldry in the rest of the world outside of Europe. I'm
Have
not
analogs.
exactly
In Central Asia, the tamgas, basically cattle brands that were put on livestock and felt and yurts and what have you. But yeah, that was heraldry, as it was in Europe, was a fairly unique to Europe phenomenon, especially to like the degree of like individual heraldry. House heraldry or house-like symbols were more widespread, but often were very oblique. For example, various Chinese dynasties, they had strong connotations with fire, water, and the classical elements, but they never had a per se like display or like item or shield that represented them. Like connotations with houses in aristocratic lineage, yes, you had, but has done up and as systematized as heraldry, it was unique to Europe.
Um, can you think of any specific reason for that? Would that be mainly sort of the specific? Would that sort of be the combination of like? Would that basically just be because of like the combination of development and this kind of decentralized feudalism, that there was this necessity to have, because like families and so forth were more permanent and had more power than comparatively to say Asia or wherever, or like in the Muslim world or in India or so forth.
The development of heraldry in Europe is very interesting because basically, when okay, to go a bit on a tangent here, but so legions were identified by their legionary standard, right? Well, in the medieval ages, legions are gone, and so are their standards. So how the hell do you identify which troops are which and who commands them and to whom to send orders? With the heraldry, basically. The heraldry started as that in the battlefield. That's why the first and most ancient heraldries are often intensely simple and like composed of very clashing colors, so that you can, in the heat of battle, figure out who's where, who's died, etc., etc., etc. Like it's like to make the chain of command immediately available to your troops and to the enemies as well. But that's a different point. So yeah, it served a very important tactical and strategic, well, strategic to a degree, in which in that you could figure out which pretty instantly which of your aristocrats were like skimping on providing the levy, but mostly it was a tactical function of figuring out who's who and where they are, basically. So yeah, it is very unique to post-Roman Europe in the sense that with the collapse of centralized Roman authority and basically a militia slash levy style of warfare was naturally inclined towards that. There was also the factor of armor, because as plate became more popular, heraldry kind of took a secondary role in the battlefield, because by that point, literacy, actual standards and banners and what have you were becoming more popular, as opposed to literally just the surcoat, which is the piece of clothing that knights used to wear over their chainmail. So yeah, that's also like a factor. Chainmail, because Europe was really big on chainmail when you think about it. Like chainmail is very peculiar to Europe as well. Most other countries used plate mail, plate mail.
I mean, there's a strong tradition of chainmail in the Arab and Indian world, but
They used kurgs and stuff, like a mixture of plate and chain. While in Europe, chainmail really like developed as the center of armor, and later as an undershirt to plate armor. Both in India and the Arab world, and for very reasonable reasons, like if you wear a chain on your body, you will fucking melt in the blistering sun. They used a style of armor that's called kurg, I think, which is steel plates or like hard iron bits that are interlinked with one another via chain. But pure chain armor is a very much European thing.
Well, it's incredibly heavy as well. So like it gets very, very heavy and very, very warm, which obviously is not like a good thing, as you say. Yeah, I think so. Someone has asked a question, but they've said they don't want to speak, which is, what is your opinion on Balkan monarchies and the Balkans in general? And then thirdly, what importance does Balkan nobility have compared to European nobility? So I think to really like look at Balkans monarchies and the Balkans in general, it's first necessary to really point out that, or sort of begin the consideration with the Ottomans and like the breakdown of the establishment of Ottoman control, and then the subsequent breakdown of Ottoman control in the Balkans. And I think for my basic opinion of the Balkan monarchies is that the monarchies, except for Serbia and Montenegro, actually also Albania with like Zog and so forth, were fairly external to the populations. And I think that a big reason why places like Greece, which had and Bulgaria and Romania got rid of their monarchies. I think with Romania and Bulgaria, the reason is quite obvious, which is basically just communism. But I think with Greece, there was still this kind of lingering view that he was just like Danish and that he was kind of a foreign prince. And that is a sort of serious issue with a lot of these Balkan monarchies and these kind of new monarchies that formed from the remnants of the Ottoman Empire, that they were just kind of seen as foreigners. And so, you know, especially in the case of Greece, they were seen as no better than the Ottomans. And I think that the interesting consideration there about the view of these new monarchs as kind of themselves occupiers and so forth is that I think, especially in places like Greece, where there is very, very low confidence in the government. I mean, Greece probably has the lowest confidence in the government, lower than like anywhere else other than maybe Romania, which is incredibly corrupt. And I think that in large part that has to do with the way that the Greek state formed and the fact that the Greeks were not really on board with the new system and the new regime. Even you know, like the people who had helped form it, which was mainly sort of merchants and so like Manoites and Phanarites and so forth, were kind of disappointed in the formation of a monarchy. They'd wanted a republic and so forth. So I think there is a connection between the sort of foreignness of the Balkan monarchies and their kind of the failure of the Balkan, like the failure of the Balkans to really unify. I'm not sure, Makos, would you agree with that?
You approached the topic well, but I think that your approach was too focused on Greece and not focused like on Serbia and its environs, because it's a very important point there. Is that in the Balkans, as opposed to widespread Europe, especially in the Albania and thereabouts, but wider spread, is that tribes were still an important societal phenomenon, especially in Albania, where they were a determinant political and societal phenomenon for the area even before the state existed. And this tribalish, clannish attitude like just pervades the Balkans throughout. And you see this very well explained in the overthrow, basically how the Karadoviks got to power. The Karadoviks got to power because the previous dynasty was all murdered by the royal guards, which swear an oath to die for their king, because the king thought about making a peace treaty with Austria and tried to normalize relationships in an attempt for peace and possibly improve the economic state of the kingdom. But his guards and the Serbian people at Wild and the Serbian establishment interpret this as a betrayal of Greater Serbdom. This is a very particular Serbian example, but this is kind of a concern that existed in the back of every other monarch, because there was this, essentially the Balkans are extremely nationalistic at a very fundamental level, and that does not mix well with any monarchy in general, but especially new ones. Basically, I mean, again, Greece is a good example of that, but in Greece it's also more complicated because you also have to understand that the state was trying to enforce a more classical Greek on the population vis-a-vis the contemporary Greek. There were a lot of discussions as well, not in the case of Greek, but the notion of the people can kill you if you betray insert nation verb here, it was very real and contributed significantly to the instability in the Balkans in historical context. This is almost a running gag there, basically, and this contributed significantly to the instability and just difficulty in the monarchies kind of not even assimilating, but just dealing with minorities. Like in Yugoslavia, this was like a fundamental problem during the monarchical era, in which the different kings and different princes and governments were like always struggling with the difficulty of trying to either make a more pro-Serbia state for fear that the Serbians would kill them, or trying to make a more pro other Balkan people state. But the issue still remained that if they went too far, the Serbs would rise up and try to kill them. The breakdown of Yugoslavia is a reflection of these concerns, and like how difficult, if nigh on impossible, the issue was to overcome historically, and arguably still today.
Well, yeah, because I think that this kind of the clannishness that you mentioned there, I think, is quite interesting, at least in the context of what I raised about the Ottomans. That I think there is a degree to which, if you look at say the Middle East, I think in many ways, the Middle East and the sort of former Ottoman Empire and the Balkans are in many ways quite similar, I think. Obviously, the Balkans went through communism, socialism, so forth, where the former Ottoman Empire didn't really.
Depends on what you.
And I think it. Sorry.
It depends on what you consider Bahathism to be.
Yeah. Obviously, it depends on what you consider. That's why I was trying to put in the caveats there. But I think that there is an interesting similarity there. That if you look at kind of this, I think really all of this kind of region should be considered like former Ottoman Empire, as it were. Because of how dominant the Ottomans were in that region, in the sort of in the rest of that region, and I think it is quite interesting in that respect. And obviously, then on the point of Balkan nobility compared to European nobility, I think that there is your point about like tribalness and so forth does kind of indicate the difference, I think, which is that the Balkans, I'm not sure can really be described as having a nobility in the way that Europe had a nobility, because European nobility largely, especially later on, largely relies upon some degree of state recognition. Whereas these tribes don't need state recognition, they are just themselves. And so the leadership of said tribes, which are probably the closest you can have to nobility, or like the most powerful family within a tribe, who would be the equivalent of the nobles, and were what European nobles were sort of 200 years ago, was sort of 200 years, not 200, sort of in like the high Middle Ages or whenever, or even earlier. So there, I think there is there's this distinction that European nobility was far less clannish. It was kind of a strata that stood above and beyond.
Fundamentally international, as opposed to Balkan nobility that was fundamentally national.
Yes, yeah, that's a very good distinction, and I think because that also then gets to the point that like these kind of, like if you look at say a lot of nobles in like the I don't know a lot of nobles, like they are rich and then they have like a title, and then they fraternize with other people who are recognized by say their government in this kind of way. Whereas with these within the sort of early Middle Ages, the nobility would basically relate to people below them. So the king would marry the dukes or the count like or baronesses and so forth. He would not really, and I think you can see this with like, and then basically as you start getting more complex state forms, bigger states, larger states, you get a move towards sort of more international marriages. And so, that it, like dukes in one region would marry dukes in another country and so forth, which actually posed quite an issue for especially in these sort of semi-feudal times, which again I think is not really a thing that the Balkan nobility had, and in many ways I think that's why a lot of these kinds of Balkans monarchies were then kind of artificial, because they were sort of, except for I think obviously in Serbia and Montenegro, where they, it was just kind of the largest clan, as it were. Whereas, Michael of Romania, House of Romania, or House of Greece, these places were far more European monarchs in the farthest reaches of Europe, basically, I think, which is a interesting. It's interesting the way that it interacted, I think.
Some monarchies were also more successful based on previous understandings of history, like the notion of a Bulgarian state with a Bulgarian head, with a Bulgarian monarch at its head, or a monarch in general, was fairly established in the minds of the Bulgarians. What with the two preceding Bulgarian empires, less so in the mind of say Bosnia, which its kingdom that at its height reached quite a high level of power, but later due to like feudal fragmentation and just bizarre succession laws, just fractioned into nothing. Yeah, when we mean tribes, we're like talking like cutting quite a wide brush, because powerful landholders also played a role in this, more so than tribes, depending upon the area. But in general, yeah, to boil it down to the tribes is not a wrong way to do it.
Yeah, I think clans might even be a better term, though, just because it is. I think clan is kind of more neutral, but yeah, I mean, I think also there's the point, the sort of inevitable point about geography, which is that most, like historically, prior really to sort of the 20th century, you could very easily be in the Balkans and like be a Serb or whatever, but not interact with other Serbs. Like you could live in your own village or your own little valley, so on and so forth, and get on just fine without without having much issue. So that is something to consider as to like the stability of the Balkans and so forth. That there is much more of this history of independence, which I do also think is part of the reason why it's like why they were so happy to be violent and kill people and so forth. But yeah,
I think that about covers it for those two questions. We have one by Darth Kilhoun, so care to unmute him, Bronze, so he can ask his own.
Sure. You should be unmuted.
Oh, I guess he's just in the voice chat, but can't or doesn't want to speak. So, I hope that's the case, Kilhoun. And if it's in our end, we're terribly sorry. So I'll read his question. What's your opinion of the Bavarian monarchs and the more minor German monarchies in general? That's a good one. That's a very good question.
Actually, I just didn't have my mic plugged in, so that's why I didn't chime in right away.
Fair enough. Care to like give some more context in your question then, or is it just does the superficial version I gave do it justice?
Well, what I meant by that question is like your opinions on the more minor German monarchies that don't get their like time in the sun, like the Prussians and Austrians always did.
Yeah, again, interesting question. So, I mean, to talk about the minor German monarchies, we must talk about like the processes that were undergoing with the creation of Germany. So, even before the Holy Roman Empire did, you had the phenomenon of mediatization or mediation. The translation is a bit wonky to English, where the smaller monarchies were basically being bought out and compensated, typically with either even bigger tracts of land inside another country, the annexing country, which is often hilarious, or just having their title recognized by the country in question. Bavaria especially benefited a lot of this, but other states, Saxony, Württemberg, and others thereabout also benefit from this process. But again, key big winners of this, Prussia and Austria, as is traditional and sad in a way. So by the time the Holy Roman Empire starts breaking apart, you have 1848 revolutions, and you have the birth of the notion of Germany, especially of the First German Empire and their weird constitution. And basically, that's where you start to see the decline of like the regional / proto-national identities of these smaller German monarchies, on most cases, with the exception of Bavaria to a degree, and like you start to see an upswing in terms of German as opposed to Württemberger, Saxon, Thuringian, etc. That's when you. So yeah. So in a way, they're already fighting an uphill battle by the time 1948 came around. Then came the North German Confederation, started by Prussia, and then came the Franco-Prussian War, which basically bought in the rest of the southern German states, with the exception of Germany.
Austria.
Well, it wasn't Austro-Hungary yet. This was like the debates between Klein Deutschland and Gross Deutschland, basically. Klein Deutschland was the one that won out. That's your German Empire. These monarchies within the context of the German Empire were also weird, because legislatively they weren't that big of a deal. The monarchs themselves typically like towed the Prussian line to a degree. It was only Bavaria that really tried to do anything, largely because the northern monarchies were all Protestants, and Bavaria was virtually alone as the Christian one. So there was a bit of like there was a degree of power play. But where they were important were at the local level, because although we see the German Empire as this a monolithic state. In many ways, it was extremely federal and almost confederal in some matters. There were actually very stark administrative and legal differences between the various states. For example, in Württemberg, if I'm not mistaken, you needed the express permission of the Grand Duke in order to marry, and he had the right to refuse any and all marriages that happened in his kingdom. Um, the So on off like their remit is often in the topic of local history more so than national and international history, which I think is sad. They play their role, but the issue with them is that history hasn't been kind to them largely for structural reasons. The consolidation of the German state during after World War One, the consolidation of the German state post unification, simply always had a more centralist unification bend than say a particularist bend that could potentially fan the flames of secessionism. You see this. I mean, you see this especially in the state of Hanover, which is a bit ignored for the West because it's often seen as the British proxy in Germany. But actually, the state of Hanover was actually quite beloved by some important German statesmen. So much, in fact, that after World War II, there was kind of a low-key conspiracy to restore the state of Hanover. They did to a degree in terms of borders. The name sadly didn't stuck. I guess I can't remember quite Rhine North-Westphalia. I think that's the current one. But yeah, there was like actual some of these states actually had there were people who had a very strong emotional connection to these states. It's just that history does not find it pertinent to talk about them. But in many ways, they were quite unique and had quite the role to play in the German Empire, especially at the local level.
Yeah, I mean, I think also the other I think the other thing that's interesting here is that the a lot of these local monarchs do still have relevance in Germany, especially at the very, very local level. So like not maybe the kings or whoever, they sort of bugger off, but especially in West Germany, the kind of the Freiherrs and the barons or these sort of like counts and below, basically, because in those cases where they were very small, these kinds of tiny princes, they often had a very close connection to the local communities, and so that those connections still exist, and so they turn up with the mayor or whoever, and they do the Christmas celebrations, so forth.
Yeah, they cut ribbons and speak at events and so forth.
Yeah, and so they still have some kind of relevance, which I think is actually quite interesting because it's I think in that sense, West Germany is probably the last place in Western Germany. It's probably the last place in Europe that has an authentic nobility, basically.
You can find that also in Portugal, in the extreme northeast of the country as well. But yeah, in such a widespread geographical area, and especially a widespread geographical area that is not horrifically isolated, yeah, it is pretty unique.
Yeah, and it's that I think is the minor German monarchies. I mean, even the Bavarian monarch is still he's actually still more popular than the Prussian or the Prussian. I mean, you could technically call the Austrians minor German monarchs now. I think more, and they the Habsburgs are very popular in Austria and Hungary. Obviously, Eduard Habsburg is the ambassador
to the Vatican. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah,
to the Holy See.
Yeah, to the Holy See. Yeah. So he runs around and he does stuff, and I mean the Bavarian monarchs I think do similar stuff. So they I think have survived better in many ways compared to Prussia or the French or whoever. The French do have it in some isolated areas. They still have a few, but I think the German monarchs and the princes at the local level are especially still quite relevant. More so, I think, than the larger ones. And I think this is largely just because they were so local. They were kind of, and also because by the time of the German Empire, they were no longer the tax collectors. So then they were just kind of almost by the time of like the late German Empire, they were basically just doing like ribbon cutting and basically were kind
I mean, one could say
of
that.
the were very like constitutional monarchs.
I mean, you could say that they survived.
Sorry, what were you going to say?
They survived, I think, quite well, because in a sense they have a soft power instead of a hard power. You know, they don't. They, in the sense that because they weren't really involved in like the making of laws and such, but in being a very influential person in the local community, almost.
Yeah, I think that's a good comparison because I mean, yeah, if you compare it to like, I mean, like the English nobility are basically non-existent. I mean, like there are people with titles, but I don't think you can really call them nobles in the sense of like medieval Europe. Like they have no local responsibility. I mean, maybe there's some Scottish lords who have some local stuff, but like the Duke of Westminster or whoever doesn't really do anything. He just sort of, yeah, I mean, especially like, yeah, they don't really do anything. Where I think there is still some kind of local dynasties in Germany, which is quite interesting. And I think in a kind of historical perspective of like formation of Germany, I think the Bavarian monarchs are quite interesting there, because they do kind of they played quite a big role, and they were quite important. I think one of the sort of interesting things of history, obviously Himmler was the son of the court physician for the king of Bavaria. And what is interesting about the Nazi Party in general is that a significant portion of the Nazi Party were essentially just like, they were the sons of.
There were a lot of the higher ups were related to former functionaries of the Kingdom of Bavaria, and the Bavarian and the NSADP started as a Bavarian before it became National Socialist, basically a Bavarian Workers' Party. Started as a Bavarian populistic successionistic party. So Bavarian successionism is still like a force in German politics. It's perhaps not the same way Catalan and Basque or the IRA in Northern Ireland, but it is a thing that exists.
Yeah, I mean, also the I think more sort of more generally, my point was that a lot of the higher ups of the Nazi Party were functionaries of these minor German monarchs in general. So when the Weimar Republic was established and those monarchs lost a lot of their power and money, they had to fire their courts, and those courts basically, a lot of them went to like political radicalism, of which a lot of them ended up in the Nazi Party, basically, or their children ended up in the Nazi Party, which is, I think, kind of an interesting historical contingency. I don't think it says much about the monarchs, more that it says about the fact that, like, these court functionaries were educated and so forth. They were cut above the rest, as it were. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of my opinion on German monarchies in general. I'm not sure, McCost, you have much else to add?
Trying to think here if there's something that we haven't touched yet. Yeah, there is. Yeah, I'm not like I can't think of very much nothing at the moment. So yeah, unless Dark Calhoun has an aspect of the question that we didn't answer, I think this about covers it.
Yeah. So young voter fraud has the next question. So Bronze, if you could unmute him, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, so you should be muted.
Hi.
No,
Is this working?
Hello. Yeah, we can hear you.
Cool. My question was, what would you do to promote monarchy in a country like the USA? And how would you tell people, like your parents, that you're a monarchist?
So I think McCost would be the most relevant person here, just because me and Bronze live in the UK, and so it's like fairly easy to, like, we have a monarchy, so it's like not a strange thing to be pro monarchy. But like,
I do live in a republic. I mean, Portugal and its republic are not as the republicanism isn't so embedded in the mind and the fiber of the country as is America. But I think I have the most relevant experience. Basically, when telling others you are a monarch, you must be ready psychologically for what I like to call the 3 hour talk, because it is often just 3 hours. 1 hour to explain, no, I don't want a dictatorship with a crown. No, absolutism wasn't just feudalism, or just you don't want feudalism again. And in the final hour is the one you explain your what type of monarchy you prefer. So basically, first dissuade and kind of directed thing you have to do is dissuade the misinformation surrounding monarchy. That's a big one. In fact, I would wager it is a primary one, like dissuade what it is, what it means, and what it implies, basically. Second, and this goes more to the question of what would you do to promote monarchy in a country like the USA? A lot of monarchists, more so on the internet than necessarily in real life, but it's still relevant to this question, are very esoteric and theoretical. If you're going to talk to someone into monarchism, perhaps don't start with yo, bro, the Bible says you have to have a king. The divine right of kings is first often poorly explained by many, and second, a hard pill to swallow for the uninitiated. One should focus first on, like, for example, rural areas, the localist aspects, more urban areas, perhaps on the better parliamentary dynamics and attitudes towards problem solving and problem exploitation, vis-a-vis vis-a-vis a republic. Yeah. If you're going to convince someone, just try to make them see how actually messed up the republic is in its operation on a daily level, and try to correlate oftentimes the problems they have to a republic. This isn't particularly difficult.
Yeah, lead with how current systems of government fail to serve most people, rather than Habsburg's beast. That's usually a way you can put people off.
And also, some people appreciate like a greater degree of thought into things as important as governments than just being drooling over aesthetics. Yeah, it's especially in American monarchy, it's very difficult. But yeah, also don't out of the blue start jacking off either the Habsburgs or the Romanovs. Especially the Romanovs, that's a big yikes because most people's history isn't that solid, and when they think Romanovs, they think Nikki too, and that's not a high point for either monarchy or the Romanovs.
yeah, I mean, I think that there is the fact that, like, most people you will meet, especially in the US, who are monarchists, will be exposed to a kind of internet culture that is off-putting to the uninitiated. And if you want to explain kind of rationally and clearly why you think that a monarchy is the best, especially in the US, I think the a good thing to highlight would be the fact that especially now the president in the US has the powers of a monarch without any of the kind of responsibility or any sort of gravitas.
I mean, on one hand, yes, but like, uh, especially when you're talking to more set upon their ways Republicans, they're well, perhaps deep Republicans, those who actually think about the parliamentary dynamics and what have you, won't really be convinced, say, with just it would create a person with more direct responsibilities and different gravitas. That's good to convince like other monarchists of another type of monarchism, not so much to convince those who are skeptical. A focus on institutions, because really that's what it's all about with the various types of monarchies. Who the king is, while not irrelevant, is often not as important as the institutions that surround them. So I would recommend, especially trying to convince other people's first, like expose like the structural and logical flaws of the republic, how they don't try to solve issues, they try to exploit them for votes. They only solve the issues when said issue runs a risk of potentially creating a new political force. Point out the parties don't represent anyone but themselves. Like good criticism of republics is a good entree, basically, because oftentimes people share those exact same criticisms and doubts. They haven't either heard them expressed or they haven't ever really considered monarchy as an alternative. So presenting monarchy as a regime that A is more than just aesthetics, B actually brings a benefit to society structurally, and C can actually do something for the people, or at the absolute minimum, not screw them over on a structural / systematic level. So yeah, when you're trying to convince people, the main thing you'll run into anywhere really, especially when you're trying to talk to just not even necessarily Republicans, just people who like the way the things are, because either they actually are benefited by the system or just that ignorant, is the topic of I don't think hereditary right is fair, basically. They will sometimes bring about this, oh, it isn't really fair that only a dude gets to call the shots or whatever. I would recommend in these very particular cases to bring up the fact that voting is hereditary, and point out, okay, where's your test? Where's your voting test? Where are your citizens? Are your citizenship tests? Because if it boils down to meritocracy, it's fairly easy to use meritocracy to just point out how absurd it is to use meritocracy alone as a factor. If they bring up elections as a way to do that, point out that it's who has most money and campaigning who wins, less so than the best candidate. And second, the best candidate is not always the best ruler. In fact, I would wager never is.
Yeah, and I think an interesting thing to consider, at least with the institutions, is that if you look at, say, if you look at the way that a republic works, of where the administration are subject to, or the administration are subject to the whims of a changing government, as you may see with like someone like what Donald Trump has done recently, where he's fired most of the State Department and so forth, and that has produced kind of a large overturn, and I think which is damaging for like long term growth and so forth. And I think something that you can point out that, say, places that are more monarchical, more focused on the long, or that have monarchies and that are focused on the long term, are able to coordinate society in a much better way and have much longer term planning, because you have monarchs who are monarch for their entire life, as the head of state, as the head of the administration, which kind of I think reduces the ability for people to have this kind of very high overturn of monarchs of not of monarchs, of administration, which is increasingly a thing in the West in and so forth. I think on monarchy in the US, I think obviously you'll eventually get pounced with the question of like, okay, who should be monarch, like who specifically. Now, I think you could.
Never answer that question with yourself. Never, ever, absolutely under no.
That's a bad one.
Yeah, that's laughing stock tier.
Arguably, good answers to that question are not very specific.
Yeah, I think the best answer to that would be that would be like that would be dependent or like contingent or contextual. So like whoever depending on the process by which you get a monarch, that would be you'd have to have some method of deciding. I would caution against saying anything like someone descended of like Washington or something like that, because that's not particularly, or like a founding father, because there's so many of those people that it's not particularly precise. And then also, so then you'd need some kind of mechanism to choose. And then also it just seems really larpy, I think. And like if if you come across as really larpy, you'll just sound like a nerd, basically. Which
don't engage in like a romanticization of like the past or like fetishizing historical periods. Like, oh, it was all so good back in the whenever.
Those periods have their benefits, but they also have their malefices, basically. On the topic of selecting monarch, if you absolutely are very much being fucking pressured to give an answer under whichever hypothetical consideration this is, you can, however, draw from historical examples to like propose at the very moment, so that at the absolute minimum, you like presented an answer rather than actual policy. But the Polish-Lithuanian Pacta Conventa style, just write down a set of clauses or base requirements that the hypothetical monarch should have, and offer and put those and basically put the offer out there, and see basically who's willing to take it. Alternatively, you could mention election,
like in Norway in 1985.
Both that. If though I can understand why some would be iffy about like straight up, oh, here I am presenting this highly anti-republican system. Oh, how are we going to pick the first king? Oh, with an election. So don't go by that. But you could like also like do something more tailor-made for America. For example, if you want like a more a hypothetical America that's more decentralized and each state has its own monarch or what have you, then you could say, oh, they pick amongst themselves or something like that. Yeah, there's no set monarch, basically.
Yeah, but don't say the American states will act as the electors of the Holy Roman Empire. That just...
Because first, many won't know what you're talking about. It's the Holy...
And people who do know what that is will laugh even harder at you, because that's not how it works.
It's not how it works. But yeah, stuff like this, like if you want an HRE like system, but don't want to fall on the pitfalls of that, mention something like Polynesia. No, wait, Malaysia. That's
Malaysia.
Malaysia. That's where they do it like that. So
yeah, I think in general, the best idea would be to know. Sorry, what did you say, Mikos?
I said the best point is the best idea in a discussion about this topic in an American context is to dodge that bullet, basically.
Yeah. I think
just do what every undergraduate student does when they find some sources that contradict their original thesis. Just say, this material is beyond the scope of this review. Like that's.
Yeah,
Mm.
I think you can admit like there will be like difficulties at least setting it up. I think that's not an unfair thing to say. I mean, obviously, elections are not or like selection processes are not easy themselves. So it's not unfair. I think or you could point this out that like it is not unreasonable thing to suggest that it's not unreasonable to say that the system by which the monarch comes to power would be subject to chance, and that maybe people would at the time decide how it is without sort of deciding a priori sort of construct this kind of grand system by which you have some selection, just kind of do it at the time. I think that would be the best way to discuss it. I think
because like all historical contexts, how the king came to the power in that specific state is often a product of how the state was built or created. So in a hypothetical scenario of a monarchical America, by the time you have set up the monarchical apparatus, as it were, who will be the king will rapidly become apparent. So it seems like a big deal now, but in the hypothetical alternative ideal world that this situation comes to pass, it will be a lot less complicated when the time comes, basically.
Yeah, and I think also there is this. Yeah, I think basically that. Yeah, I agree with you there, Makoska. I think also I would also suggest don't say Caesarism or anything like that. Like suggesting who. Sorry, Makoska.
Yeah, because this is a bit outside of the scope of questions, but in amongst American monarchists, the fetishization of the army is also a big fucking deal. Don't say to people, "Oh, I want the army to seize power and a general to like declare himself king and become hereditary monarch." Historically speaking, especially if you're Haiti, the results are mixed on that process to power, are mixed. So not a good sales pitch. And second, even weirder in the context of America and the army, like worshipping the Constitution, etc. Like suggesting that is more wrong than you might think. To especially your very much Constitution abiding American politician or your Constitution abiding service member. So
I think sorry, slightly off topic there. One sort of interesting point or interesting thing about Caesarism in the context of the U.S. I have seen this sort of association of general seize power, Bonaparte style. But what's interesting there is that the name Caesarism there, I don't think is actually all that appropriate, because Caesar was primarily a like his claim to power was that he was like head priest. So it was like a civilian function. He became general, and that's like how he got his money. But like his primary role was not as a general. So I think it's kind of strange that people have this association. More the yeah, I mean it would be more like the head of the Baptist Association or something. Like I don't know what the largest religious organization would be in the US. That they would
Episcopalian Church, maybe.
Yeah. The Archbishop of the Episcopalian Church declares himself hereditary monarch.
Montenegro solution, you mean?
Yeah. That would be quite interesting, I think, if the Episcopalians seized power in the US.
Also, a thing to go back to, because Caesarism also brings to mind Bonaparte. I'd like to remind that Bonaparte and his family were Corsican nobility. Low nobility to be sure, but still nobility. So the transfer from military power to hereditary civilian regime um is not it's not a straight line. Is all I'm saying, and not a good like it'll make you seem like a fool, basically.
I think specifically in relation to the to the promotion of monarchy in the US, I think the best option is to try and not seem larpy, to not seem very silly, and to just kind of be normal about it. Basically, I think would be the best suggestion.
Yeah, don't start laying on that heavy ideological shit at the first question. Doesn't go well. Just criticism criticism of republics first, then you ease into like structural benefits of monarchy. One of these episodes will actually like talk about like pros and cons. Like one day we'll actually like record an episode on like topics like these. So if you're struggling for ideas, don't worry, we'll help you with that one eventually. I mean, this you is more general, like to use, and not necessarily Dark Kilhoun or Young Voter Fraud or anyone else in this chat.
Yeah. So I think that's sort of an important point. I think monarchism in the US I find quite interesting in general. I mean, who are the two Catholic guys? One of the guys met up with a Croatian monarchist. I can't remember his name now.
You mean off the menu, Tumblr House?
Yeah, Tumblr House. Yeah.
Charles Coulomb and Vincent Franchini.
Yeah.
They're the ones that do the show Off the Menu.
Yeah. I mean, I quite like their show. They,
They're good.
Yeah, they are good. But I think they, in general, I think they have the most sensible position, which is that like, and I think that the support for the monarch, like you should support a monarch, some monarch, whatever, but don't come out with these kinds of, and I want a coup or descend into the founding fathers or whatever. Especially the founding fathers thing, I find very strange because they were all committed Republicans, which is a very obvious sort of strange thing. I mean, if you wanted to be specific, you could say you could mention Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton. He was a monarchist, so that would probably sort of be a good person to mention. That you say, oh well.
If you like want to ease them into the notion of monarchism in America, basically to prove that you're not crazy, try to mention like the Prussian scheme and like other considerations about like the idea of monarchism in America is not new. Also, tangentially related to what has been said, don't try and make yourself a traitor. That doesn't go well, especially not in America, I wager. But just don't start a conversation saying, "Yeah, I'm willing to overthrow the government and kill the president." Not a good conversation starter.
Yeah, I think that in general is not a. I mean, the most obvious sort of answer of like how would be you can. There's a process in the United States whereby which the states can call a congressional constitutional convention, where basically if each of them passes, if I think it has to be that if every state passes legislation in their state legislature, they can call a constitutional convention to amend the Constitution without having to go through Congress or the Senate. And 2/3 of states. That would be, you could suggest that, because obviously I think it's quite unlikely that the Congress or the Senate will come out and support it. So you could say that you build support for it at the local level, that the states do it. I'm not sure if the states themselves have to be republics, like if they have to have governors.
I think they are required to be republics. Yeah.
Okay, so then it would have to be sort of do a big. I mean, you'd probably have to do a big constitutional convention anyway. That would be, I think, the best sort of thing to put forward, because
Yeah, don't go. I want the descendant of George Washington to do a coup, marry a Habsburg, and make the SSPX the state church.
Yeah, that's the quickest way that you're going to start getting like caught, like looked at funny by your parents or whoever you're telling this. I think the best option then is really to say, try and do it as try and do it legally, basically, and say, I'm not trying to. I think that this is genuinely the best system. And I think,
but also make sure that not the entirety of your position is not monarch based. Like, you have to have other opinions as well.
Yeah,
you got to be sort of like have like a sort of well-rounded system that at least makes a little bit of sense.
Yeah.
So to cap off this question with a brief recap, localist approach works best. Second, talk about institutions and what monarchy can do for them. Oftentimes start with criticisms of republics on a structural level, especially when I say structural, like point out how the issues are inherent to the functioning of any republic and not just this or that formulation of republic, because that's often the point. They often say, oh, but why couldn't just abolishing the two-party system solve the issue? First, because it wouldn't, and because it's how republics work. Like, framing it specifically this way will both speed up the conversation and b guard yourself against oftentimes nitty-gritty constitutional considerations, unless of course you enjoy nitty-gritty constitutional considerations, in which case go full force, my friend. But yeah,
I think, yeah, I mean, I don't think that I think one of the big issues that monarchists online have is that because of the way that most people come into being supportive of monarchy, it's not it's not the case of like 200 years ago where almost all monarchs in the West are gone, and so any kind of consideration, like monarchies now in general, are either associated with something quaint and antique, or they are the quaint and antique, or associated with some kind of primitiveness, like Saudi Arabia or United Arab Emirates or Malaysia or these kinds of places. And so I think the best option really is to try and present yourself not as a hyper reactionary, and I think that hyper reactionariness that a lot of people who come into monarchism have can be quite unhelpful. And I think, at a certain level, it's always good to hide your power level, as it were. But I think I think I'd like to finish up now, because I'd like to get back to doing some reading before I go off to uni. But I think,
but I mean, I feel like that's a good sort of place to conclude.
Yeah, we also have no further questions. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks
Yeah.
everyone for participating, and yeah, see you in 10 episodes.
Yeah, see you in 10 episodes. Have fun.
Yeah, and everyone at home, thanks for listening, watching, and remember to reblog and Snapstagram it all over the interblogs and the tubes.
I've been I am.
I've been Bronze.
I've been McCosk, and this has been Monarchism Unfiltered.
Good night.